Microphone because it's being recorded. I think it's very official. We're delighted to have Greg Valliere with us today. Greg is the senior research strategist for the Potomac Research Group, and he is going to share with us some of the goings on in D.C., which I think will be very interesting. He's often interviewed by CNN and CNBC, and so we're delighted to have him. If last year was any indication, it was very engaging and insightful. So, Greg, here you go. Thanks.
I have a microphone, so I don't think I need this one, right? I don't have to have that. Okay, I'll just leave it here. Well, thank you. Great to be here. I'm happy any day I don't have to fly. That's tomorrow, trying to see if I can get to Seattle with all of the delays on flights. A lot to talk about this morning, and thank you all for coming here, and Will, thank you for hosting this. I'm going to talk about three big themes, and I would just say at the outset that I am not an ideologue. I'm not a strong advocate of either party. I think after doing this for so many years, I'm a cynic more than anything else. And I think it's warranted when I see what goes on in Washington. So I'm going to talk about three big themes. The three big themes are, first, how I see monetary policy unfolding, the Fed, interest rates. Secondly, fiscal policy, which I think is increasingly looking like a pleasant surprise with the budget deficit falling dramatically, with fiscal restraint now firmly in place. I'll go through my reasoning for being optimistic on that. And then third, I want to talk a bit about the political climate where a big story is unfolding. That big story is the clear sign to me that Barack Obama has begun, a little earlier than most second-term presidents, but he's begun to enter the lame duck stage, starting with his humiliating defeat on gun control. And I'll talk about some of the implications as the president, like all second-term presidents, becomes clearly a lame duck. I would start by ranting for a couple of minutes. I've only had one cup of coffee, but permit me to rant and bite the hand that feeds me, and that is about the media. The media often making things look hysterical, hyping stories to scare people, to get higher ratings, to get more people to read their newspapers. We did not go over a fiscal cliff in early January. The government did not shut down in March. We are not going to have a debt ceiling default crisis this summer. The Mayan calendar didn't come true, and on and on and on. Yet the media is always hyping stories because I think they want to stir things up. Perhaps one of the biggest offenders are all of my friends at CNBC. I tell my friends at CNBC, if you guys thought you could televise live rooster fights if it was good for ratings, yes, they would televise live rooster fights. That's the way CNBC approaches things. I'm personally, not because I'm on a lot, but I am personally a bigger fan of Bloomberg. I think their discourse is more reasonable. There's less yelling and screaming. Yet, what bothers me most is that so many of the themes right now are really quite positive, yet they're not appreciated by the public. I'll talk in a few minutes about the plunging budget deficit, but there are so many other stories that get no publicity. For example, we are now undergoing a renaissance in manufacturing around the country. My dear friend Liz Ann Saunders, who's at Schwab, often points out that when people ask her, where's the hottest area in the world in terms of manufacturing, she's now saying the middle of America, the Midwest. As you see all of these companies from Europe relocating in the U.S. to take advantage of extraordinarily low energy prices, natural gas prices being so cheap, which leads to another point. We're having a renaissance in energy, and I think that within the next few years, who would have thought this, the U.S. becomes energy self-sufficient. What a great story that is. You look at housing. We were talking at breakfast here about housing values in this area picking up, and I travel all around America, and you clearly see a pickup, maybe even a bubble. I'll talk about that also later. You look at the auto industry doing much better. You look at corporate balance sheets, probably in the best shape of our lifetime. You look at the states. I would argue that of the 50 states, 48 are now in pretty darn good shape. Maybe California, I'm not quite sure I would include them in the 50, but things have gotten better. that might mean there's only one state out of 50 that's truly a basket case, and that one is a really big basket case. That, of course, is Illinois, the most dysfunctional state in all of America by far. But 48 or 49 out of 50 ain't bad. You see more and more Democrats now realizing you have to make reforms in municipal employee benefit packages, and on and on and on. A lot of really positive stories. These themes are overlooked as the media wants to talk about falling off a cliff, things like that. Well, let me talk now about the three big themes that I think are quite clear in Washington. The first, and perhaps the easiest one to talk about, we'll only spend about 5 minutes on this, is the extraordinary dovishness at the Federal Reserve, which will maintain an accommodative monetary policy for the foreseeable future. I think I mentioned to this group last year that in my career, this is by far the most dovish Fed I have ever seen, and I am very fortunate. I work with Don Cohn, who was the vice chairman of the Fed for many years, and Don points out that when the minutes come out after their meetings, the FOMC, the minutes come out a few weeks later, and the press inevitably wants to find a conflict. Well, this guy thinks we should get tighter on monetary policy. This fellow or this woman doesn't want to have any more quantitative easing. The press overlooks the fact that the vast majority at the Fed, the voting members, are totally on the same page. The voting members are in agreement that we'll stay accommodated for quite some time to come. I don't see much chance at all that QE3 will end anytime soon. It's not out of the question around Thanksgiving they might decide to do a little less than $85 billion a month. They add $85 billion a month to their balance sheet in mortgage-backed securities and treasuries to keep interest rates low. It's not out of the question that in November or December they might scale that back a little bit, but they'd still be adding to the balance sheet. They would just be adding to the balance sheet a little less. They are very sanguine on inflation. They look at things like tip spreads. They look at inflation expectations. There is no sign that inflation is close to any kind of a bust out. In fact, latest inflation data would lead some people to feel that deflation is still not out of the question. I don't think that's a real threat, but there certainly is no inflation threat that the Fed worries about. The one thing that I would say gets a respectable hearing at the Fed comes from a new governor who is quite respected intellectually. His name is Jeremy Stein from Harvard. He is not an inflation hawk, he's a bubble hawk. And he worries that the Fed policies are maybe starting to create some bubbles, maybe in real estate, maybe in the bond market. Until a few weeks ago, people worried about gold, although I think that's pretty much subsided as a bubble threat. So I think this Fed policy will continue for a while, and people say, well, Bernanke's going to retire, right? He's going to step down, we think. I have reason to believe that he would like to go back to Princeton in January when his term is up and teach and write. But when he steps down, in all likelihood, he'll be replaced by someone even more dovish. And that, of course, is Janet Yellen, the vice chairman, who is the odds-on favorite to become the next chairman of the Fed. Her views on interest rates and how you tie it to unemployment, I think, are to the left of Bernanke. So I would just end the quick comments on interest rates and Fed policy by saying that for as far as the eye can see, I think rates will stay exceptionally low. You'll have this tremendous trump card for the stock market. And many of you who followed the stock market as I have for decades cannot argue with the old cliche, which happens to be a true cliche, that you don't fight the Fed. And I think the Fed is that trump card that will keep the stock market in pretty good shape. So that's the first big theme out of Washington, a very positive one on balance. I understand that Chuck Schwab doesn't like Fed policy. My mother doesn't like Fed policy. She was counting on much higher yields in her retirement. A lot of people feel the Fed has done too much, but they will not be dissuaded. This policy will prevail. Second big theme is one that I think, frankly, virtually none of the public appreciates, and many people in the markets don't appreciate how significantly things have changed on the fiscal policy, on budget deficits. The ocean liner is beginning to turn. We're never going to get a Simpson-Bowles, $3 trillion deficit reduction package. That's not how Washington works. We work in increments, and it's messy. I'd be the first one to concede. It's a very messy process, but if you look at what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, a mood of fiscal restraint is now in place. And the budget deficit numbers, I guarantee you, as the year goes on, maybe you'll remember this breakfast, but as the year goes on, you're going to see more and more stories about how the deficit is plunging. Right now, I'm comfortable in saying that the deficit in the new fiscal year, which starts on October 1, will come in below 5% of GDP, below $600 billion. The forecast is $615. It'll come in below that. The next year, fiscal 2015, the deficit will come in well below 3% of GDP. Post-World War II average is 3%. I think we could get below 2.5% in 2015, 2016. Why is this happening? Well, 3 reasons I'd point to. Number one, receipts have been a pleasant surprise. There was a little pop late last year as many people took capital gains in November and December ahead of the increase that we all got in January. But even Xing that out, receipts are doing well because the economy has picked up a bit. Corporate receipts are very strong because of earnings. And I think the pleasant surprise on receipts may persist because the official forecast by the Congressional Budget Office for this year is for GDP growth of 1.4%. That's way too low. Even with a weak second quarter, after a good first quarter, we'll get the number on Friday, I think growth this year will be far above 1.4%. So receipts look better than we thought. Secondly, there is no new spending. There will be none whatsoever. The House, a story that I'll come back to several times this morning, the House is the trump card on everything. The House is quite insistent that there will be no new spending. In fact, when Obama had his State of the Union address, he listed all these new spending programs. He calls them investments. I keep telling my wife I want to invest in that new Mercedes SCL 550. And she says, no, that's spending. That's not investing. But the president said in his State of the Union address, he wants all of these new programs, and none of them will add a dime to the deficit. And I said the next day on TV, he's right. It will not add anything to the deficit because none of it will get enacted. There's no chance in the world that we're going to see any new spending. And I think that is pretty much in place for at least the next 2 or 3 years. The third reason why we're seeing this improvement in the deficit is something I've never seen in my career. We've talked for decades about cutting spending, but in truth, we were simply reducing the rate of increase on spending. Now we're in an environment where we actually have real cuts. If you look at Congressional Budget Office data, domestic discretionary spending is falling. Not as a percentage of the budget, but it's falling in real dollar terms. We see that with the sequester. I think the sequester this year will not be changed. There's going to have to be a deal at some point on air traffic controllers. And I think the president is going to be late, and he's going to have to see his job approval rating drop before he realizes something has to be done. But I don't see the sequester ending. In fact, the debate will soon turn to whether we need another sequester next year. These are real cuts in spending, and I don't see this type of cutting going away anytime soon either. In fact, the next big story on the budget is going to be a deal late this summer to raise the debt ceiling that actually will impose more restraint. In fact, I could make an argument, I'm not a lawyer, but I can make an argument for a lot of pros and cons. I can make an argument that we might overdo it on restraint. It might take too much out of the economy in a quick period of time. This next deal, I thought, would have to be done before the August recess to raise the debt ceiling. But receipts are looking so good for Treasury, we may be able to wait until after Labor Day. They need to raise the debt ceiling by probably $600 billion, which would get them through the 2014 election. They don't want to deal with this ahead of the 2014 elections. And $600 billion will cover an entire fiscal year now because the deficit is coming down. I think it's quite doable. I think that we will move in this next deal to the next frontier on deficit cutting. First we did taxes in January, and I must tell you, just to digress, and then I'll come back to the deal, I don't see much more on taxes. For you guys and for your clients, I think what you see is what you're going to get for a while on taxes. The Republicans had a disorderly retreat in December on taxes and finally agreed to raise taxes for the wealthy. While they were disorderly in December, they are astonishingly united right now against any major new tax hike, certainly in the House. I don't see much wavering from that position in the House. In this deal that I'm talking about late summer, we could see some cats and dogs on taxes. Maybe finally we kill carried interest. I talked to a lobbyist a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine, who said in the lobbying community, the big surprise is that carried interest has prevailed for so long that it hasn't been killed before now. There might be a little haircut for oil and gas companies that get tax breaks for drilling and exploration, just the big companies. I don't think it would have a big impact on their earnings. There could be curbs on the use of corporate jets, which of course yields a ridiculously small amount of money. It's more symbolic than anything else. But I would say the tax hikes that we get in any kind of deal late in the summer would be very minor. And while I'm on the topic of taxes, I would say the chances of fundamental tax reform, corporate and individual tax reform, are pretty slim. Max Baucus stepping down, to me, is not a huge story. It's not like Congress is going to rally around Max Baucus. He's not popular in his own party. It's not like, let's win one for Max, like many Democrats said about Ted Kennedy for health reform. I think the two big problems on fundamental tax reform are quite clear. Number one, any reform bill that raises revenues would be in huge trouble in the House that is not inclined to raise any new revenues. And number two, while the concept sounds seductive, let's lower rates for individuals and companies, the details are really difficult. The details, despite this seductive premise, the details are, do you want to kill just about every tax break? For corporations, many of which pay far less than the rate we might get in a reform, they don't want to lose accelerated depreciation. They don't want to lose the R&D tax credit. On the individual side, there's great reluctance to do anything about the mortgage tax break or state and local tax break. So I'll believe tax reform when I see it. I think taxes may stay sort of where they are for a while, including in this deal that I'm talking about. So we move on to the next frontier. We've done taxes. We've had real spending cuts. The next frontier, obviously, is entitlements. That's the gorilla in the room. That is the issue that has to be addressed. And I'm on the 50-yard line. I'm not an advocate, as I said at the beginning, but I give Obama credit for taking on his own party, inviting the wrath of many on the left. I'm sure, Pelosi, a lot of people from this area who don't like the idea of any kind of change in the COLA, the cost of living adjustment, which would be tweaked slightly. I tell my mother, who says, oh my God, they're going to cut my Social Security. And I said, no, Mom, it's a 0.3% reduction in your increase. You'll still get an increase. If inflation is 5%, maybe you'll get 4.7% increase. That is not, in my opinion, an onerous cut. But if you do this, the advantage over the years becomes exponential. And if you apply this not just to Social Security recipients, but to federal retirees, over 10 years you'd gain $280 billion. That's a pretty good chunk of change. And I think that in this deal we get later in the summer, there'll be something on COLAs. There'll be additional Medicare reforms in how we pay providers, how we pay recipients. The White House has proposed $400 billion in Medicare reforms, actually more than the Republicans in the short run. And there'll be some of that in a bill. There'll be some additional cuts in defense. There'll be some additional cuts in farm support programs. You throw in cats and dogs on taxes, I think you could easily come up with $600 billion, which gets them through the 2014 election. Why do they have to do that? Well, John Boehner, here we go again, the House. The House is insisting. They want offsetting cuts for whatever amount the debt ceiling is raised by. So if we raise it by $600 billion, the House is insisting on $600 billion in savings, and I think we get it, and I think it reinforces this mood of fiscal restraint. Again, messy, not grand like Simpson Bowles, but it's occurring. So the ultimate question, to wrap up on fiscal policy, is how long could this persist? Could we see this go on for a while? And the answer is pretty easy, in my opinion. The answer is it'll persist as long as the Republicans hold the House. So that allows me to move into the next big theme, and that, of course, is the political climate. The House has a magic number of 17. Only a 17-seat net pickup by the Democrats would give them the House back. Sounds easy, right? It's not that easy. There are many reasons why I think they probably will fail to get to 17. First of all, a second-term president in his final midterm election usually does not do well. This would be unusual to see Obama get the 17 seats, number one. Number two, this tremendous coalition he put together to defeat Mitt Romney, Hispanics, a wide range of ethnic and cultural groups, they don't turn out in midterm elections in the numbers that they turn out in a general election. Number three, and more importantly, is when you look at the 2014 election and look at all these districts, the way the districts are drawn, some might say gerrymandered, makes it really tough to have a big turnover. In fact, my friend Charlie Cook, who's probably the best in America at handicapping these races, feels there might only be 25 competitive districts in America. And I think, therefore, the odds are against the Democrats getting their 17. So that means this mood of restraint would prevail. Even if Boehner leaves and we get Eric Cantor, I think the mood of restraint will prevail for at least 2 or 3 more years. And while I'm on Congress in 2014, the magic number in the Senate is 6. A 6-seat turnover would give the Republicans control of the Senate. That sounds like a lot, right? Well, believe it or not, there are 7 seats held by the Democrats in states where Romney won comfortably, including Montana, where Baucus is stepping down. You look at Arkansas, Pryor, you look at Alaska, Begich, you look at Louisiana, Mary Landrieu, you go on and on and on. There are a lot of vulnerable seats. I'm not willing to say the Democrats lose the Senate, but I am willing to say the Republicans will pick up several seats in the Senate. So I think this mood of fiscal restraint could even be reinforced by the election in 2014. Which brings me to another political issue, and that's the fact that I have argued for the last week or so, and I think I'm right on this one, that years from now, as historians write the biography of Barack Obama and the history of his presidency, they will look back at the gun control vote as the beginning of his lame duck status. How do you lose a vote where 90% of the public wants background checks? He controls the Senate by 54 to 46. I understand he needed 60 votes in the Senate. He couldn't get 6 Republicans to vote for background checks, you know, Susan Collins and some other moderates. Maureen Dowd, who is arguably one of the more liberal columnists in America, had a scathing column in the New York Times on Sunday. If you didn't see it, I recommend it. She eviscerated Obama as someone who doesn't know how to get things done. He's bright, he makes a great speech, he's got a nice family, but he has a problem. I think it's in his DNA that he has a problem being gregarious, being an arm twister, being a head basher, doing all the things you need to do to get things through Congress. I recall LBJ, obviously Reagan, obviously Bill Clinton. They knew how to get things done. They were always schmoozing, massaging, talking to people in both parties. I was told late last year, and I may have mentioned this to you guys last year when I was with you, that in all of 2012, people who know all of the players say that Obama talked to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid maybe a dozen times in the entire year. LBJ would talk to people 4 or 5 times a week, often when he was in the bathroom. You had Bill Clinton would talk to these people almost daily. And the president, I am told, talked to committee chairmen, Democrats in the Senate, maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So the chickens are coming home to roost, that he is famously aloof, very cerebral, but aloof, and he couldn't even get this gun control bill passed in Congress. So with that opening everyone's eyes to his vulnerabilities, I think now he's on a slippery slope. I think that his job approval rating, which had been a little weak, could dip further. It might go up a point or 2 after Boston. But I think that the next big story, airline delays is not going to reflect well on him, as people feel that this is a contrived crisis to try to end sequester. I think there's going to be a lot of anger in the flying public. And then you have to ask the question, is he really going to play a pivotal role in all of the key issues remaining in his second term? The biggest remaining issue, obviously, is immigration. And I would argue that this will be decided not really by him, but by Chuck Schumer on the left, Marco Rubio, a little closer to the middle, and Ted Cruz, the very conservative Tea Party Republican from Texas. I think Rubio will prevail over Cruz, and the Republicans will agree with the Democrats to an immigration reform bill that probably won't involve the president that much. Just as an aside, we all have our own personal opinions. My take would be, from an economic standpoint, there's a lot to be excited about in an immigration reform bill, both macro and micro. On the macro side, we need more citizens. I mean, look at Japan. Look at the problem they're in right now. Well, one of the key stories that I think is overlooked is birth rates around the world. You need about a 2.2 birth rate just to keep population stable. The replacement rate, you need 2.2 births per couple because of people who die. Japan is 1.3. Japan is contracting dramatically. We're about 2. Our population growth has stopped, and we could start contracting. Much of Western Europe is 1.7, 1.8, below the replacement rate on births. We're going to add 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 million new citizens in the next decade. People to pay Social Security taxes, people to buy things. That's not a bad story to have our citizenship go up when countries like Japan are contracting. On a micro standpoint, I like the deal because one of the great issues for America's high-tech companies, Microsoft, IBM, is finally getting reform of H-1B visas. They've been fighting for a decade to get more skilled workers to come into the U.S., and I think that reform will occur. I think we'll get a bill, but I don't necessarily see the president playing a huge role in getting this bill. I don't see him playing a huge role in several other stories. Cybersecurity, the next budget deal will be cut by Congress. And really, what does it say that in the last really big budget deal, the fiscal cliff deal back in January, the key negotiator by far, the king of the negotiators, was Joe Biden, not the president. So I don't see his clout increasing. You know, barring, God forbid, a geopolitical crisis, and I'll talk about that in a second, I don't see the president regaining a lot of momentum because he's going to get bogged down in the next few weeks because of airline flights. So that's a quick political overview. During Q&A, I'd love to talk about 2016. Already people are speculating that, talk about deja vu. Could we have a Clinton race against Bush in 2016? I'll talk about that. If you want to talk about that in Q&A, I'd be glad to do that. But let me finish up by saying that while I'm quite sanguine on monetary and fiscal policy, a great combination for the markets right now, you have to ask the question, what do we have to worry about? And Will and everybody in our industry, we're all paid to worry for our clients. What do we have to be concerned about? So let me throw out a few things that I would worry about. First and foremost, I do think that the sleeper issue of the decade is cybersecurity. We saw yesterday the market go down 150 points in a minute because somebody hacked into the Associated Press Twitter account, reported that there was an explosion at the White House, Obama was injured. I'm told that the Federal Reserve has been hacked, the Pentagon has been hacked numerous times, and it's been reported, and no one refutes this, that every one of the Fortune 500 firms in America has been hacked by China. There's a division of the People's Liberation Army in Shanghai, in a building in Shanghai, that has hacked into every company in America in acts of industrial espionage. The Wall Street Journal reported earlier this week that the U.S. has got to retaliate, whether it's trade retaliation or prosecution or trade complaints with the World Trade Organization. There will be retaliation. I worry that Washington is behind the curve. The bill to greatly improve coordination of cybersecurity efforts is already bogging down like it did last year over threats of a veto, over disputes over privacy rights. Maybe I'm a troglodyte, but I think that sometimes privacy rights are overemphasized when there's a crisis like this. So that issue, I think, is one that will be with us for the decade. Banks have been hacked, but the hacking has only disrupted their activities. I don't think people's accounts have been affected, but there's a lot of scare scenarios out there as China, Russia, Israel, France, and other countries become more proficient at hacking. Another thing I'd worry about that the markets will be concerned about is that with a president who can't get much done through the House, the regulatory environment is going to be quite activist in that he will attempt through regulation, through executive authority, to get what he cannot get through legislation. And I would argue that the ground zero in this area is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which hates coal, famously hates coal, and will probably soon propose new regulations curbing what utilities can burn, probably reinforcing the country's love affair with natural gas at the expense of coal. And I wouldn't rule out EPA also taking a good hard look at fracking to look at groundwater contamination. And EPA this week has weighed in on Keystone Pipeline, which has been vetted for like 100 years, and now the EPA is saying we need to vet that even more. So the EPA is going to be a very activist regulatory agency, as will be the SEC under Mary Jo White, as will be the Medicare agency. I don't, by the way, see any real change in Obamacare. People say, could that be delayed or any big changes made? No, I don't think so. I think the device tax will stick. I think that it's highly unlikely you see any big changes there. So the regulatory climate will be quite activist. That's another thing that the markets worry about. But the biggest thing, and I hate to end on a bummer, but we do have to talk about the biggest thing to worry about in the world, obviously, is geopolitics. And we got to wake up in Boston. Maybe these were two lone wolves. Still, the jury is still out on that. But I think that Boston made it quite clear that we sometimes forget that there's millions of people in the world, brainwashed people in the world, who would love to kill everybody in this room. And for us not to believe that is naive. We get so preoccupied by the Kardashian sisters or Lindsay Lohan, all this BS, and we fail to acknowledge the really great threat to our way of life. And that, of course, is the threat from radical Islam. I think the greatest worry to me, other than a one-off event that you could never predict of terrorism, the greatest threat, obviously, continues to be Israel-Iran. I talked about this last year, and I told all of you how much I worry about it. Nothing has happened, and I'm happy. This is one you don't want to see come true. But in the sense I was with all of you, I think you have to say that the Iranians have made real progress in their enrichment of uranium. I think they're closer to a crude bomb. The Israeli Mossad says it's only 6 months away. The U.S. says it's a year away. What's the difference? It's still coming within the next year. The Iranians will have a crude bomb. There have been no progress. There's no progress whatsoever on negotiations. The Iranians stonewall. The only progress we get is to agree to more negotiations. And you all remember what happened in Munich. The Germans got another year in 1938, and they had another year to rearm and build their defenses. And I think it's analogous to what's happening right now with the Iranians. Maybe after the election in Iran, June 14th, the focus really will turn to a possible Israeli strike. I think between now and June 14th, I'd be surprised if there was any possibility of a strike. We'll see how the election turns out. But that's an election where, as I'm sure you know, there are no reformers. The Ayatollahs pick the candidates. And the moderate is the protege of Ahmadinejad. He's the moderate in this race. And the other candidates are even more fanatic, all handpicked by the Ayatollahs. And I do think as we get into late summer, early fall, the great fear in the markets is going to be, what could happen between Israel and Iran. It would not be a 1 or 2 or 3 day series of airstrikes. This would take many weeks to clean out all of the Iranian facilities, many of which are buried deep in the mountains near the holy city of Qom. The Israelis have very sophisticated bunker-busting bombs. I'm not sure they have the best one of all. We have one that goes 1 mile beneath the surface of the earth. The Israelis apparently have bunker-busting bombs that go about a half or 3/4 of a mile beneath the surface of the earth. This would be a very messy conflict. It would be a very messy conflict for global economic growth, for the price of oil. You can't sugarcoat that one. I would like to think that there's a way we can avoid this. Could sanctions work? Well, as you all know, the Iranian economy is in shambles. Their currency is in free fall. Their people are suffering, but the Ayatollahs don't get out much. I'm not sure that they're aware of what kind of suffering is occurring among their own people. So I don't think sanctions necessarily will work. The one thing I would be hopeful for is that the U.S. and Israel are working on some new computer virus like Stuxnet, which a few years ago retarded the Iranian nuclear progress. Maybe we are. Maybe we can halt them in their tracks through a computer virus. But barring that, I think as we get into the latter half of this year, that's going to be an enormous concern for the markets. I don't put Kim Jong-un on high on my list. I think he's sort of run out of bellicose things to say. I don't see that. The only thing I'd worry a little bit would be an accidental war, as John McCain and others have worried about in public, that a shooting episode metastasizes and becomes worse and worse and worse, and we stumble into a war, maybe like the start of World War I. I think that the threat of a huge conflagration on the peninsula is pretty unlikely. The big issue, again, is Israel-Iran, the threat of terrorism. I worry, as all people in Washington who follow this worries, about Pakistan, which now has over 100 nuclear bombs, a country that is quite radical in many respects, where the Taliban is becoming far more active in the northwestern provinces. So there are obviously things to worry about on geopolitics. But I would conclude by saying that, to me, as a big picture guy, when I look at the big picture in my city, when I look at this exceptionally dovish Fed, when I look at real progress being made on the budget deficit, at least in the next few years, I think things are far better than are generally appreciated by most Americans. So I'm going to stop there. I know, Will, we have plenty of time for questions, disagreements, so fire away. Love to take some questions. Yes, sir.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One is, there's a lot of talk about how dysfunctional Washington is.
Yep.
It's never been this bad, and I'd like your take on that.
Yep.
And the second is, do you think, that there's any likelihood that Congress would succeed in trying to pass some legislation affecting the Fed's power or ability or anything like that?
Two good questions. The first one on Washington being dysfunctional. Will that change? No, I don't. I think the main problem, in my opinion, is the collapse of the center. I mean, people who are more centrist, who like to cut deals, have left. Scott Brown, gone. He's not going to. I don't think he's going to run again. Joe Lieberman, retired. Dick Lugar of Indiana, defeated by an idiot in Indiana who lost the seat for the Republicans because he talked about rape in a stupid way. A lot of other centrists, Ben Nelson of Nebraska, going back a little further, J. Bennett Johnson of Louisiana, and on and on and on. Centrists in both parties who could cut deals have left. Olympia Snowe, another example, a moderate Republican from Maine, she's gone. So you have on both extremes, the Tea Party's still there, and you could argue that the two hottest Republicans in America today are really conservative. You've got Rand Paul, who has great support among young people, perhaps not coincidentally because he supports the legalization of marijuana. And you've got Rand Paul, who's very far to the right, and you've got Ted Cruz of Texas, an exceptionally conservative Tea Party Republican. And on the left, I think you're going to see more Democrats becoming vocal. So the center has collapsed, and I think that's a major reason why it's awfully hard to get things done. That said, I do think that they were so humiliated by what happened between Christmas and New Year's. I mean, Washington looked laughably dysfunctional, that I think it has prompted them to at least make some progress on the deficit, and they are. Your other question was?
Is Congress, is there any likelihood the House or Congress will pass the legislation?
Curb the Fed. A couple of things I'd say. Well, first of all, Darrell Issa of California is determined to get from the Fed an explicit statement on their exit strategy. I'm not even sure the Fed knows what their exit strategy is going to be. I think the Fed would prefer to unwind this enormous 3+ trillion balance sheet of assets they bought. They would prefer to see most of these assets just be held to maturity and very slowly unwind. The last thing they want to do is dump a whole bunch of stuff into the bond market in a period of rising interest rates anyway, if they did that, which would just add gasoline to the flame on higher interest rates. The Fed, according to my friend Don Cohn, they feel fairly confident they can unwind this very slowly and not cause any disruptions. But the Congress will snoop around on that. Congress could be very assertive on who they confirm or not confirm. Janet Yellen could have a rocky hearing, but I can't see Janet Yellen being denied if she's the nominee to succeed Bernanke. The bigger two issues are this. One would be to have an audit of the Fed, which Ron Paul, father of Rand, has always demanded, and that's still out there. It lurks as an issue. The other big issue that the anti-Fed types, and they're everywhere, when I do speeches around the country, and I mean, the virulence toward the Fed often shocks me. I think Bernanke's a hero. But there are many people who question the dual mandate. The dual mandate meaning stable inflation and low unemployment. And many people are opposed to the latter, that it's not the Fed's prerogative to have policies to lower unemployment. So could there be a change in the Fed's mandate? I don't see it. I mean, it could maybe pass the House, but I can't possibly see it passing in the Senate. And in the extremely unlikely event that it passed in both houses, I think this president would veto it. And I think many Republicans would as well. So I don't see a realistic chance of significantly curbing the Fed's authority. And I think, you know, if Congress tried to do that, I think the market would backfire. I think that the markets get worried when they see politicians trying to influence the Fed. And so I'm pretty hopeful that there won't be any overt success in curbing the Fed's authority. Yes, sir.
A growing number of people seem to be pointing to the lack of mobility in the country, the growing wealth of the top 20%,
Yeah.
and the stagnation of the other 80%.
Yep. Yeah, it's a serious issue. There are so many issues out there that are improving only glacially or getting worse. I mean, this income disparity, this is a big deal, and it's not going to be changed overnight. The level of underemployment, I mean, unemployment officially is at, I think it's 7.7 now is the number, but most economists would agree that it's really a lot higher because of discouraged workers. There's some debate in the economics profession about a demographic shift, that many people in their 60s are choosing to retire earlier than they had planned, and that's adding to the drop in the workforce as well. But there are many factors that are real problems. I mean, Michael Bloomberg has warned about, you know, social unrest if we see these trends persist. I'm not sure where we're headed on this, but I would think that a rising tide, a much better economy would lift most boats, but this economy still is awfully mediocre. I mean, I don't see the typical type of GDP growth that you usually get after a severe recession. I don't think not even a wild-eyed optimist would tell you that we can grow much stronger than 3.5% a year for the next 2 or 3 years. It's going to still be very modest growth. So this trend will continue, unfortunately. Other questions? Yep.
You brought up the possibility of conflict between Israel and Iran,
Mm-hmm.
late summer, fall.
Mm-hmm.
Is your sense that that's highly unlikely, likely? I mean, if you had to handicap it, what would you?
I'd say that an Israeli-Iranian conflict after Labor Day is at least a 1 in 3. You know, I wouldn't go crazy and say it's a 70% chance, but you know, if someone told me my flight to Seattle is a 1 in 3 chance it's going to crash, I might drive. You know, 1 in 3 I think is probably, you know, 1 in 3. I mean, Netanyahu got a wake-up call in the last election, and that there's a big faction of more moderate voters in Israel who detest the move to fanaticism that the Hasidim has brought to Israel, and they want a more secular country. So Netanyahu did get a wake-up call from a big chunk of the Israeli electorate that is not as militant as, say, his defense minister, Lieberman, and many others who want to confront the Iranians. But if you look at what the Iranians have done in that part of the world, they've picked the wrong side, as always they do, in Syria, siding with Bashar al-Assad, who's a butcher. The Iranians are loathed throughout the Mideast. I would argue if the Israelis go, one of the happiest countries in the world would be Saudi Arabia. They wouldn't say anything in public, but in private, the Saudis would be like, yeah, you go. I mean, they would like to see, everyone in that part of the world would like to see the Iranians taken down a peg or two. So there will be great pressure on Netanyahu. And as much as I would like to think there could be an intervention by a third party, I don't see Putin doing it. Putin has sided with Bashar al-Assad. I don't see the Chinese are the only country that is an intriguing player. I think that it's not in the Chinese interest to see a war between these two countries, which would be very negative for global economic growth. It would hurt the Chinese economic self-interest. So maybe they could be an intermediary in trying to negotiate a settlement. So I'd put it at 1 and 3. Being an optimist at heart, I'd prefer to say that there's a 2 out of 3 chance there's not a war. But 1 and 3, I think, is realistic. Yes, sir.
You talk about this environment of cost consciousness and the like that's in Washington, D.C. With that, I'm sort of baffled at the recent decision to not allow the Postal Service to continue to deliver junk mail to me on Saturdays.
Yeah.
It seems like it's low-hanging fruit.
Yep.
How do you explain that?
Yeah, I thought someone might mention that, and that certainly contradicts my belief that we are seeing progress on outlays. These people are chicken when it comes to the postal services. It's a portrait in cowardice that Congress is so scared they're going to get angry emails and phone calls, not letters, angry emails and phone calls from their constituents saying, how dare you close my post office in East Buffalo, Kansas? How dare you have the temerity to do that? Eventually, this will have to be addressed. And part of it was just Congress being very jealous about its prerogatives and its power to curb the Postal Service is going to lose like $20 billion this year. And you could argue that it's a dinosaur, that it should be just, savaged. But again, many politicians, especially from rural areas, are reluctant to close post offices on Saturday. I think it's an outrage. I probably can get angry. There's about 4 or 5 things I can get really angry about, and that's one of them right now. Absolutely. Yes?
I seem to be hearing a fair amount of consensus about sort of continued slow growth and low interest rates
Yep.
for maybe 1 year, maybe 2, but can you talk a little bit about a little longer term horizon beyond that? And you made one reference to
Yep.
the possibility of a bubble.
Yep.
What happens when we take the lid off?
At some point, rates are going to go up. I mean, I don't think it's this year. I think if I'm here exactly 1 year from today, maybe the Treasury 10-year bond yield is 2.1 or 2.2. It's probably 1.75 now. I didn't look at it in the last few days. Maybe it's what? 169. Yeah. Thank you. So I could see rates, the Treasury 10-year bond yield go up by 40 or 50 basis points in the next year. But that's the economy can certainly survive that, especially if the rates go up in response to an improving economy. That's a good story. I don't see rates going up in response to inflation because inflation's, you look at unit labor costs and all these inflation indicators, I just don't see that. So the bigger concern to me would be a gradual rise of rates significantly higher by the end of the decade. Let's say the Treasury 10-year bond yield gets to 3.5%. Then you get into the great reason why the deficit has to still be attacked, and that is debt servicing costs. Debt servicing costs is a huge elephant in the room, and that could eat up over 1/3 of the discretionary part of the budget if we see interest rates go up significantly. That's why, you see Paul Krugman and others. I mean, I happen to agree with Krugman. I think austerity is not the approach right now, and I think we've overdone it in Spain or the UK. I think austerity's been too harsh. But Krugman is dismissive of any deficit reduction effort right now, and I think that's misguided because you need to do stuff now because later this decade, debt servicing costs are going to become an enormous issue, a very, very important issue down the road. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Do you see any chance of major infrastructure projects coming through which might sop up some of the
I don't.
form this increasing underclass.
Yeah.
What are we gonna do?
I don't, I just don't see the money right now being appropriated. Again, I go back to the House, I keep coming back to that theme. I don't see the House agreeing to any big new infrastructure spending. No, not on green energy. I mean, Solyndra took care of some of that, I think, for a while. But no, I sadly, you're all in a state that has, to me, as a Northeasterner, this has wonderful infrastructure. You go to Philadelphia or Boston, I mean, things are crumbling there. And there just isn't the money. I mean, I think the only answer, in my opinion, would be the private sector. I think the private sector may do more funding of big projects. They will issue their debt. They will make it profitable. I think the private sector can help on infrastructure, but in terms of a government contribution to a big infrastructure improvement that the president keeps talking about, he doesn't have the votes in the House to get it. It's a
It
simple.
doesn't have to be either or, it can be a combination of government and private.
Could be, but there's a great aversion right now, and again, I keep going back to the House. I'm sorry to be redundant, but there's a great aversion in the House to doing anything at all, even cooperating, private sector, public sector. I just don't see it. You know, if Richard Branson wants to take some of us to the moon, God bless him. You know, but I don't see the government getting involved in a lot of this stuff. Yes, sir.
You mentioned you had some comments on the 2016 election.
Sure. Well, let me just say this. All the Republicans I talk to say that most of the candidates are waiting to see what Jeb does. I mean, I've argued if his last name was, you know, Berkowitz or Moskowitz or O'Reilly or, you know, Santino, he would win the Republican nomination, but his last name is Bush. Now, this week, tomorrow, there's the dedication of the George W. Bush Library in Texas, and George W.'s numbers have gone up. George W. is a little more popular as a person, maybe not as policies, but I would think that Jeb has to make a decision pretty soon. The reason why he's holding the rest of the field back is that Jeb can out-fundraise anybody. He would raise an enormous amount of money and probably push out Rubio, Christie, a whole bunch. If Jeb doesn't run, there's about 15 Republicans in America who look in the mirror every morning and see the next president. There's a huge amount of Republicans. You know, Jindal will run, although he's had a terrible winter. Santorum is definitely going to run. Christie will run if he's still alive. Paul Ryan may run. The list goes on and on of Republicans. I would say right now, my sense is that Rubio has the most upside. He didn't do very well in that speech where he was really thirsty, but I think that, you know, I think Rubio has a chance to be viewed as the architect of a really dramatic piece of legislation. Now, this is not going to help Rubio in Iowa. I mean, the Republican base will contend he favors amnesty, and he's not going to win Iowa. I mean, lest we forget, the Iowa straw poll was won by Michelle Bachmann. The Iowa primary was won by Santorum. So Rubio knows he's going to have to focus on the bigger states. I think Rubio, I would make Rubio now the slight favorite. On the Democrat side, most everyone I talk to says that Hillary will run as long as she's sure that the health scare that she had, her fall, and she had a cerebral incident in double vision, as long as that's resolved, and I think it is, I do think she'll run. I think she's not enthusiastic about spending a year in Holiday Inns in Iowa and New Hampshire. She showed 5-6 years ago she does not run a good campaign. It was a dysfunctional campaign. But I'm told she passionately believes it's time for a female president, and that she's obviously the only possibility in that category. So I do think she'll run. If she doesn't, I have a dear friend who works for Joe Biden who says Biden is definitely going to run if she doesn't. He's 70 now. He's been known to make a gaffe or two, but I think that he would run with the enthusiastic support of organized labor. You know, beyond that, you know, Andrew Cuomo, Elizabeth Warren is the darling of the left. I couldn't see her win a general election. So you could probably make a credible case of a Bush, a Hillary race, but my sense is right now it's more likely a Rubio Hillary race. That'll be an interesting race. Way too early to say who's the favorite in that one. That'll be a very interesting race. Maybe take one or two more. I'm going to hang around if you guys have other questions, but yes, sir.
Just following up on the election, what do you think about a third-party candidate emerging and taking a meaningful percentage? Either Rand Paul on the right or left, depending on how you look at it, or Chris Christie in the center, for example.
Well, Paul is a very, very interesting player, but I think he wants to keep his powder dry and stay in the Republican Party. I don't see him going outside of the Republican Party. Christie is the most interesting politician in America by far. There's only one politician I could compare him to who just said whatever he thought and never looked at a focus group or a poll. That's Ed Koch, who died a few months ago. No, I don't see that. He's got. He said, yeah. Well, he did. Yeah. I would say that a third-party candidate is really a quixotic, to use that word. I mean, Bloomberg, as I always joke, has 22 or 23 billion reasons to run, you know, and he could spend $2 billion and it would be a rounding error. But Bloomberg's got a big problem, and a lot of us on both coasts, and so this is a liberal town, I live in D.C., don't appreciate the fervor that gun advocates have against Bloomberg. Bloomberg is so militant on gun control that I think it would poison his candidacy. Final point I'd make is that you look at third-party candidates, and rarely do they really affect an election. You could argue Perot helped Bill Clinton. In 1912, when I was just starting in this business, you had Taft and Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, and that gave the election to Wilson. And the trivia question: the last third-party candidate to get electoral college votes, there may have been one protest vote for John Anderson, but think back, the last third-party candidate to get any significant electoral college votes was George Wallace in 1968. You have to go back a long way to see a third-party candidate have much of a chance. So I tend to doubt it. I think I'm going to get the hook, but I'll be around if any of you have other questions. And you've been a great audience. Thank you very much.